Now, here is Ticky Fullerton on Your Money.
Hello there, I'm Ticky Fullerton. Every night bringing you a full hour of the very best in business coverage across the nation and internationally, especially where business and politics meet. Coming up, well, a huge week for Sanjeev Gupta, our exclusive TV one-on-one with the steel and energy king as he talks the new growth strategy for Whyalla, plans for an Australian IPO, his latest big acquisitions in Europe and the US, and his response to those who say he has too many plates spinning. Economists shuffling back on when the next RBA rate rises, some even suggesting it will be a cut. So what does former RBA board member Professor Warwick McKibbin, who's wanted higher rates, think of the new mood? And what does the 5G spectrum auction deliver for Telstra? And what's its response to the ACCC new inquiry into wholesale access for telcos on its copper network? Well, business editor James Daggar-Nickson speaks with Telstra CEO Andy Penn. Now, a big gathering of state and federal leaders for the final and quite cooperative COAG meeting of the year, with the hot-button issue population. Melbourne and Sydney worried about congestion, but states like South Australia wanting population growth to crank up the economy. COAG met in Adelaide, and why not? Of all the states, you've got to give 2018 to South Australia. What a year for the state of wonder and for investment in the state of wonder. First and lumpiest, the $35 billion future frigate contract that was awarded to BAE Systems, which not only traverses the valley of death, of course, for the shipbuilding industry, but creates new interest in the really big global defence by really big global defence players to continue to build their presence in Australia. This was BAE Systems Global Chair Sir Roger Carr, who was in Canberra in the last fortnight.
The Hunter-class order creates a long-term future for capability, for investment, for the country and our deep involvement in it.
Next point about South Australia, the extraordinary story of Sanjeev Gupta, the green steel king, who has blown new life into the town of Whyalla, first by rescuing the struggling steel mill from administration just 15 months ago, and then in the last year laying the foundations of what is a multi-project investment in the mill and alternative energy. Well, on Monday, the Prime Minister, Bill Shorten, the State Premier and Mr Gupta were in Whyalla to announce a new growth plan for the plant and major investments in the town itself, including a brand spanking new hotel.
It is the comeback city in the turnaround state, and we look forward to that being realised in the months and the years and the decades ahead.
What you also show is the future for this country. Cooperation, not conflict. Renewable energy working with heavy manufacturing. The economy and the environment working together.
Well, Sanjeev Gupta, the man himself, is here in the studio, and our interview coming right up. But then today, the Prime Minister, ahead of COAG, announced that South Australia would bump out WA, the ACT and New South Wales for the federal government's $40 million investment in a new space agency based out of the old Royal Adelaide Hospital site, which is being converted into an innovation centre. Well, it was where the Australia's space credentials were first built, of course. Just think Woomera.
This is what vision looks like. What we're doing right here. A vision that saw this site not as a block of flats for the future, but a vision from a premier that wanted to transform this site into a job magnet. We're taking this to a $12 billion industry, and at the heart of driving that change is a $41 million investment right here in the National Space Agency here in Adelaide.
I should say not everyone at COAG was happy about yet another federal gift for South Australia, including State Liberal Premier Gladys Berejiklian, who remarked that it was time another state had a piece of Canberra's largesse. Well, some of our more mature viewers might remember something called MFP in South Australia, Multifunction Polis, a dream to create a futuristic city at Gilman, just north of Adelaide. Maybe 100,000 or more people, which would attract high-tech industries long before people were banding about the word innovation. That was back in 1990. Well, MFP would pop up as a place where work and leisure, education, research, manufacturing and multicultural values would flourish. It was going to be backed by Japanese investment, I think. It finally died in the derriere in 1998 with about $150 million worth of taxpayers' dollars gone up in smoke. An 8-year thought bubble, really. Interesting, I think, the approach in 2018 is also eating up a few taxpayer dollars, but the difference is that it's building on an existing industrial base with a firm eye on the future, as Bill Shorten was saying, actually. Defence, space and renewable energy. How this will translate into an improved economy, we can all wonder. The latest ABS seasonally adjusted unemployment rate for South Australia fell from 5.5% in September to 5.4% in October. May that trend continue. So let's kick off with the big political news of the day and Christmas cheer. I think everyone talking about cooperation at the COAG meeting, but what were the takeouts? Joining me to answer exactly that question for us, Sky News political reporter Annalise Nielsen. Annalise, how did they go at COAG? They seem to be getting on all right?
It was like a big Christmas lunch here, Ticky. Everyone was getting along famously. There was money to be had, gifts for South Australia, and a new population plan was the big sell from the Prime Minister. He said that he wanted a plan to set the migration levels, and he's at least got the states on board to be part of what he calls his population plan. So that's going to involve them by the 31st of January reporting to him their population numbers, how many migrants they want, and how that might translate into infrastructure. That's all key because it's going to be used at the next budget. So that's where the migration target will be set, and that's when the Prime Minister has the chance to add in a few infrastructure sweeteners for different states. It seems like it's going to be critical for New South Wales and Victoria in particular because they say that they can't deal with any more people moving there without the infrastructure to back it up. But Queensland also seemed like they were dragging their feet a little bit, but by the end of the day it was very happy families.
Right, OK, but no change to the actual immigration numbers at the moment in Australia from the Prime Minister?
No, we didn't see any target set. He said that's going to be revealed in the budget, among other things. But what we did hear was a pretty contentious meeting here. It was presented to by a population expert picked by the Prime Minister who reportedly actually disagreed with the Prime Minister's policy. And so we were told by some people in the room that there were sniggers when that came out and a few eyes being rolled, wondering why the Prime Minister was rolling out someone who actually says that migration rates shouldn't be cut. And it's something that the Prime Minister has been pushing for. He's just spoken again on Sky News and indeed confirmed that he doesn't agree with the Prime Minister's target of 160,000 migrants, but the Prime Minister has said that they do agree on the number of permanent migrants, and that's something that he does envision being cut.
Well, we are in election mode after all. Anything else coming out of it? The Prime Minister had a bit of money to throw around on health?
He did have a $1.2 billion sweetener this morning. That came out before the meeting even started, and so that was something that was supposed to put everyone in a good mood. We did see Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews, though, not quite enthusiastic about that amount of money. He was saying that they'd spent something similar on a refurb of West Footscray Hospital in Melbourne, and it wasn't going to put too much of a dent in the budget. I've spoken to other people who were in the room who were saying that it was very warmly received behind closed doors, and so you do have to wonder how much is negotiating tactics here, but that crucial national health agreement still hasn't been signed off on, and the other one is the education agreement. We're still seeing Victoria and Queensland dragging their feet on that one. There's a long way to go before Victoria says they'll sign up for it, and so while it was a very convivial showing with the premiers, it was only really the population plan that was actually the kind of action item agreed on.
Right, so agreement on education and health, always the holy grail at COAG. Anything else happened on, I'm thinking sort of security, terrorism, all that sort of area?
That was a big discussion. We heard from Victoria in particular. They were talking about thanking different federal agencies for their support with the number of recent alleged terrorist attacks in Melbourne. But it was something that right across the board they are saying that they do need to have a more cohesive approach, to have the states and the federal government working together. It's interesting as well, that's against the backdrop of these encryption laws seemingly being passed, and now it looks like the federal government's backtracking on agreeing to those Labor amendments that they were told they would receive on that chaotic last day of Parliament. And so it seems like this might have been a very happy meeting. Whether it's as jovial next year and then at the next meeting in July, that remains to be seen.
OK, and finally, a little bit of progress on closing the gap on the Indigenous side, getting more Indigenous involvement.
That's something that the Prime Minister was very happy with, as well as the Northern Territory Chief Minister. They've said that this was a long time coming and it has taken them quite a long time to get to this point, and so they did seem quite pleased that they have this framework going forward that's going to give more power to Indigenous communities to be working to closing the gap. That was one of the big ticket items. In fact, the Prime Minister at one point did say that he thought it was the most important thing they came to agree on at this meeting, and so he's quite confident about that one going forward.
Well, let's hope it makes a huge difference, because there needs to be one. Annalise Nielsen, thank you very much for that. Great wrap, thanks. Right, well now a new development in the multi-million-dollar bribery investigation at the heart of NAB. Your Money and Sky News can exclusively reveal the home of Rosemary Rogers, the former Chief of Staff to NAB CEO Andrew Thorburn, has been raided by New South Wales and Victorian Fraud Squad detectives this morning. Your Money Chief Business Reporter broke the news, and here is Leo Shanahan. Here's his exclusive.
Police have raided the home of Rosemary Rogers, the former Chief of Staff to NAB Chief Executive Andrew Thorburn, in the midst of a multi-million-dollar bribery investigation going to the heart of one of Australia's largest banks. New South Wales and Victorian Fraud Squad detectives executed search warrants at Ms Rogers' Melbourne home this morning, confiscating large amounts of files and computers from the Williamstown address. As Your Money and Sky News previously revealed, the New South Wales Crime Commission last week instructed the NAB to freeze Ms Rogers' accounts. The moves by police further widen the investigation into the kickback scandal, which is believed to be focused on up to $113 million worth of corporate travel provided by the Sydney-based company The Human Group to the NAB. Rosemary Rogers, the former Chief of Staff to 3 NAB Chief Executives, including Andrew Thorburn, has been under investigation by the New South Wales Financial Crime Squad over a series of payments to the Human Group over a 10-year period. Police are investigating whether kickbacks were paid by the Human Group to bank staff to secure inflated contracts with the NAB. The trips included numerous first-class getaways attended by the bank's leading executives, including Mr Thorburn. Ms Rogers and the Human Group director, Helen Rosamond, have been at the centre of the bribery investigation since Ms Rogers quit the bank a year ago. Mr Thorburn is not being investigated and is not suspected by police of any wrongdoing, and the NAB says the bank has fully cooperated with police. Despite the fact he is not accused of any wrongdoing, the fact remains there is a large-scale criminal investigation at the heart of the NAB that happened, partly at least, under the watch of Mr Thorburn. Hardly what the bank needed in another scandal-plagued year. Police are yet to lay any charges in relation to the investigation. For Your Money, Leo Shanahan.
Now then, over the last, several months, there's been a growing push from one or two economists and some in the media for the Reserve Bank to raise rates, and for lots of good reasons. Times are not too bad, or haven't been, and we should take the opportunity to build a buffer back for the RBA to give it an effective tool when times do really get tough again. And then there's the pressure from the Federal Reserve in the US, which has been raising rates, and each time creating more of a gap with us, which affects both our dollar and, importantly, bank wholesale funding. In recent weeks, though, partly because of some of the weaker economic data, particularly housing, there are other economists who are now saying that the next move that Governor Philip Lowe should be making should actually be a cut. Well, joining me for his views is former RBA board member and a top economist, Professor Warwick McKibbin from the ANU's Crawford School. Warwick, it's so great to have you here, physically.
It's great to be actually in the studio, thank you.
OK, now you were one of the people who, in past months have been saying, for goodness sake, the Reserve Bank really does need to take this opportunity to raise rates, I guess for the reasons I was sort of going through. What are you thinking now?
Well, actually, I've been arguing for several years that rates should have been on a gradual increase, and today interest rates should have been sitting around 2.5%. We knew that the housing market was being pushed up by a very loose credit, and we knew that at some point that would be a problem, and now it's a problem, and prices are starting to fall in Sydney, not starting 10% in Sydney, falling in Melbourne. Now is the time for the bank to not raise rates, and so really... So
you wouldn't
I wouldn't advocate an increase in rates now, even though on the shadow RBA board, and the question we ask is what should rates be, and I've argued for 2.5%, but it's not what rates should be now with the Reserve Bank cutting or raising. I think. So
you're saying it's too late, they should have acted earlier?
I don't think a cut is in the cards. I would be sitting there as they are now, but now they don't have as much of a room to cut as they did have if they were sitting at 2.5%. And the housing market was already excessively priced, and coming down 10% may or may not be a problem. It really does depend on the psychology of the people in the market.
So what we're saying is that they missed the window then, but the concerns were at the time, I suppose, that macroprudential would sort out the housing market, and secondly, there was this really big worry about wages growth.
Right, and in fact the bank has done exactly what their mandate says they should do, so I can't criticise them for doing what they should be doing according to the mandate. I think the mandate is wrong, and mandate needs to be updated for the world in which we now live, which is a world of a lot of technology shocks, a world of rapid growth in Asia. It's a different world to the world.
And this comes back to the inflation target that they have.
Right, correct. In a world of high debt, and we have a world of high debt, you want to have nominal growth high enough to stop the debt to GDP ratio, private or public, to exploding. You don't really care that much about inflation, because in the end, if you have excessive debt, you need inflation to get the debt levels down. That's inevitably what happens when debt gets out of control.
So you're on the shadow board, obviously. You're off to an RBA dinner tonight, RBA dinner tomorrow night. How's your sort of arguments going to go down with them all, you reckon?
Oh, I think it's actually quite good. I've engaged quite often with people at all levels of the bank. They're open to discussions. They understand my position. I actually understand their position. We'll find out in several years which position was closest to being the correct. It's hard to forecast in advance because a lot of things can happen in the world economy between now and then.
So this is a really interesting RBA conference over the next sort of 24, 48 hours, and lots of sort of central bank representatives are coming out here?
Well, it's an academic conference, so the people that are coming are academics from central banks, and the papers will be reasonably technical papers. It's a workshop looking at the latest research on issues related to macroeconomics. It's an extremely good conference of the bank funds every year.
So way over our heads, but I mean, goodness me, what's actually going on in the world at the moment must drive into a lot of their thinking.
Well, absolutely, and there's a lot of issues that we worry about, not just macro and monetary policy, but the impacts of trade on the macroeconomy. The impacts of President Trump's macroeconomic policy.
What about that? Did you see that stuff this morning with Donald Trump absolutely going it with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer about the wall?
It was extraordinary. I mean, the wall funding is a waste of money, and I think Nancy Pelosi made a valid point that there are other things that are important to spend the money on. It was pure symbolism, and what was ironic was the President pointed out that what they were doing on border security actually was having a massive impact without the wall. So then to argue that they need the wall, he undermined his own argument, not to mention the way in which
I guess, in his defence, dare I defend Donald Trump, in his defence, this was his biggest promise. It's the biggest promise in terms of his election campaign, wasn't it? And you could argue that you've got to keep going with your promise to build the wall, because if you take a step back, then the impact won't be there. Well,
that's right. If you look at the contract with America, he has done absolutely everything he said he would do except build the wall.
Yes.
And even if he does build the wall, Mexico won't be paying for it, in the same way that the tariffs on Chinese products aren't paid by the Chinese, they're paid by Americans. So he's got to push through his agenda, because that's the only thing that he's got to stand on.
Do we think that there's going to be a government shutdown? There he was saying, oh, look, if it's in the interest of border security, I'm happy to have a shutdown.
Well, I would love to have been in the room with some Republican congressmen and senators to see their reaction, because he said he was happy to shut down, honoured to shut down the government. Nobody wants to be responsible for a government shutdown. It impacts on government employees, but it impacts on a lot of people in the US economy when their payments aren't coming through.
Yeah. But it's always kicked down the road, isn't it? That's what happens with
It'll be resolved. The question is just how stubborn is Donald Trump.
Yeah.
He really lost it today. I mean, that was that amazing thing. He really lost it, and the market saw that, and the market fell.
Right, OK. Look, that's just one little tiny crunch point in the world. What are the other big risks that you're looking at the moment?
Well, just to finish on the US, in our modelling, 2019 is the year in which the US economy starts to slow down quite dramatically, because the fiscal policy of the Trump administration was a tax cut which could have increased productive capacity if people had invested the money, but they didn't. They paid dividends, they paid wages. Basically, it was a sugar hit for the US economy, and so the US will be naturally slowing. Add on to that the tariffs and the slowdown in demand coming from tariffs, and a slowdown in the rest of the world, which is being forecast by the IMF and the OECD. we're looking at a very slow year for economic growth in 2019.
How does that translate to what the Fed is going to do? And what are these dot plots going to look like on the, is it the 18th of December?
Well, it's pretty amazing. You'd have to, if 6 months ago you would have said there was definitely going to be an interest rate increase in December. I think there still will be, because if you look at the US economy, where we are right now, inflation is very low. We're at full employment. The interest rate is very low compared to what you'd expect. What's interesting is you have now got an inversion of the yield curve, which means the short-term interest rate is above long-term interest rate. Every single recession that has predicted in the past, that has predicted a recession. It could be different this time, because in the past the US was a big part of the world economy and they're shrinking in relative size. So the long-term interest rate's not just determined by America, it's determined by what's happening around the world. So it's not necessarily just a US issue, but it's fairly highly predictive that the US will slow down next year.
Right, okay, that's fascinating. Let's move across to Europe. Brexit?
Well, Brexit is like watching a train wreck.
Yes.
And you feel very sorry for Theresa May, because she was put in an unwinnable position. She's done extraordinarily well.
Should she have got off the train a little bit earlier?
Well, I wouldn't have got on the train. It was so clearly not in Britain's short-term interest. You could argue that in the long term it was a good strategy. The question is, how do you get from the short-term disruption to the long-term benefits of being free from Europe, if there are any? And it's just been, it's imploded the Conservative side of politics in the UK. I just can't see her surviving as Prime Minister, but I'm an economist, not a political scientist.
So it's not just Brexit, of course. We've got these quite extraordinary riots in France with Emmanuel Macron, and then there's Italy.
So Italy has been censored by the European Commission, because they've announced budget deficits of around 2.4% of GDP, which exceeds what is required under the Maastricht Agreement. Now, that is a problem, but I think the policy from Italy's point of view is a good policy, because fiscal consolidation with a fixed exchange rate is a very contractionary policy. So they've decided to expand independently of the rules. France was one of the... Germany,
as Greece tried to do. You know.
And I understand the argument, but their debt is like 140% of GDP. Every 100 basis points on their interest rate is 1.4% of GDP, where they have to pay out of their budget. So it's a slippery slide to a debt unsustainable
So you are quite worried about Italy?
I'm very worried, but I'm also worried now because the countries that were holding the fiscal conservative side in Europe, definitely the Germans, but also the French, Macron has now come around and decided that his fiscal constraint is no longer binding. And I can understand from the...
Well, he's got a few problems on his doorstep.
He's got big problems on his doorstep, but now he's given wage cuts, he's changed a number of policies which have fiscal implications, and France is also very close to the borderline with satisfying the requirements of the Maastricht Agreement.
Warwick McKibbin, it's great to run around the world with you. Thank you so much for giving us your views.
Oh, my pleasure, Ticky. Great to be here.
Right, after the break, a big week ahead with MYEFO on Monday and the ALP conference in Adelaide. We'll get across what to expect with the Australian's Paul Kelly right next.
You're watching Ticky on Your Money. Now, back to Ticky.
Yes, welcome back. Well, when it comes to Australia and Australian politics this year, 2018, I don't think it matters whether you are a humble house owner all the way through to the Prime Minister, or should I say Prime Ministers. It has been an extraordinary year of change. Well, joining me now is the only person I can think of to really give it some real colour, and that is the Australian's editor-at-large, Paul Kelly. Paul, welcome. Have you ever seen a year like this?
This has certainly been one of the most convulsive and traumatic years, Ticky, we've seen in Australian politics. One Prime Minister deposed, a new Prime Minister coming in August. Peter Dutton challenged Malcolm Turnbull. Peter Dutton didn't succeed. Malcolm Turnbull was deposed, and hey presto, the new Prime Minister is Scott Morrison. He's not rating well in the polls, and all the omens point to a very substantial lead by Bill Shorten going into the election year. The election will almost certainly be next May, and Labor at this point is the hot favourite.
What has driven this? Because if you look at the two leaders, Scott Morrison, Bill Shorten, the polls still favour Scott Morrison.
This is all about fitness for government. And I think the problem that the coalition faces, the problem the Liberal Party faces, is having switched from Tony Abbott to Malcolm Turnbull to Scott Morrison as Prime Minister, having had a very convulsive time of political differences between the progressive and conservative wings of the party. There's a deep sense in the electorate, whether people are interested in politics or not, that they are disenchanted with this government. They're worried about its capacity to govern effectively, and I think that's the single most important factor. Fitness for government and chronic disunity. They're the key factors which have undermined the government and made Bill Shorten the favourite for next year's election.
If I can unpack that a bit, there would seem to be two huge issues that played into that. One was energy and climate change.
No question at all about that. Australia's energy and climate change trauma continued this year. The former government under Malcolm Turnbull, with Josh Frydenberg as Energy Minister, were devising this National Energy Guarantee, which was a policy designed to bring together emissions, reliability and price in an overall package. Exactly. And it looked for a while as though this policy might get up. It had strong support from business and industry, strong support from the Turnbull cabinet, strong support from the coalition party room, majority support. But what happened at the end of the day? It failed, and it failed in terms of a crisis involving Malcolm Turnbull's leadership. There was a revolt by a small group of conservatives inside the Liberal Party, but this was tied into a threat to Malcolm Turnbull's leadership, so the neg was lost. Malcolm Turnbull lost his energy policy and then lost his job.
The other enormous factor, I suppose, has been the Royal Commission into financial institutions, something that the government never wanted to have and fought all the way.
This has been an extraordinary event. So we've seen the leadership of the financial sector discredited by the revelations before the Royal Commission. The government, which opposed the Royal Commission for so long, had to admit, of course, that it got that wrong. It's had no option but to come in behind the Royal Commission and make it very, very clear that it will be responsive to the final recommendations of the Royal Commission. The revelations, of course, have been a windfall for the Labor Party. It's done grave damage to the business community and the financial sector, and we'll clearly see next year very substantial policy responses to the Royal Commission, and again one imagines that this will be an important weapon. That is, the findings of the Royal Commission will be used by the Labor Party as an important weapon in the election campaign next year.
The other thing that happened, I think, as a consequence largely of the Royal Commission is an extraordinary shift within who runs our superannuation money, a shift away from retail funds and into industry funds, which now actually have more funds under management than retail funds. How do you see that in combination with a potential shortened government affecting politics and power in Australia? Well,
this has been a fascinating story. Now, we know that the Turnbull government was very concerned about the operation of the industry-based super funds. The government felt that these funds were channeling monies to the Labor Party, that this was fundamental in terms of the strong financial position of the unions. The government introduced a series of bills to try and reform these funds. Those bills were largely unsuccessful. And of course, the upshot from the Royal Commission was that the retail funds were discredited. We've seen a great surge of monies now going into the retail fund. So the Royal Commission has been a great victory for the retail, for the industry funds against the retail funds, exactly the opposite of what the government wanted. I think the fascinating thing we'll see now is, I think, the nature of Australia's corporate and capitalist system changing. And the big question I'd pose is whether the Liberal Party view of Australian capitalism is on the way out, and a social democratic view of Australian capitalism is on the way in, as the industry funds become more powerful and they begin to exert their influence over companies in all sorts of ways, whether it's remuneration for senior executives and company chairs, whether it's commitment to climate change. Wages, whether it's commitment to a social agenda. So the fascinating thing now is whether Australia is on the cusp of a pretty fundamental change in terms of the nature of the capitalist system. I think at this level the Liberal Party has been completely outthought and outmanoeuvred. They have failed to have a strategic sense about where the country and where the capitalist system is going.
Paul Kelly, it's been terrific to get your views. Thank you so much, and we'll catch up with you next year. Thank you.
Thanks, Ticky.
All right, coming up, Sanjeev Gupta, the green steel king. I spoke to the chief executive of the GFG Alliance on his Whyalla upgrade, just coming up next.
This is Ticky on Your Money, covering the big business stories.
Welcome back. Sanjeev Gupta is a man on a mission in Australia, as evidenced by his latest announcement of a $600 million upgrade to the Whyalla project on Monday, which he says will drive an increase in steel production from 1 to 1.8 million tonnes in just 3 years. 18 months ago, the future of the regional city was up in the air, but now residents have a blue sky future ahead. So Mr Gupta was back in Sydney today, briefly, and I spoke with the Green Steel King just a little earlier. Sanjeev Gupta, it's delightful to have you in here on your way somewhere, no doubt. You've had quite a week in Whyalla.
It's been one big week.
How can you pitch to us Whyalla?
I pitched it on that day as a diamond in the rough. So it's got every ingredient for success, and yet it's actually not successful. So it's got local raw materials, it's got great infrastructure. We have great infrastructure ourselves, a port, railway. It's got a great population. It's got housing. It's got everything you need for a successful industrial environment. It's got some of the best renewable energy resources. And yet it's it's sort of been languishing. So
were you pleased to see, given we've got the federal election coming up sort of early-ish next year, were you pleased to see both the Prime Minister and Bill Shorten and indeed the Premier all there wanting to hear about your growth story?
So I understand it doesn't have a precedence. I think it's the first time in the history of the country that's actually happened. Yeah. So it's a great testimony to the fact that this is not about politics. It's bipartisan. No matter which side of the fence you're on, everybody's supportive and fully behind it, which was a great endorsement for Whyalla.
So where are we going to see Whyalla, do we think, in, say, 12 months' time? 12
months' time, we'll be well on our way on our transformation project. So there's two parts to the story, two bookends, if you like. The transformation project, which is $1.3 billion, of which $600 million we signed contracts on Monday. Yes. And the balance will be signed sort of January, February. And then there is the ambitious future mega next steel plant. So within a year, we'll be well into the transformation project, which is sort of a two to 4 year project.
Now, you say that's ambitious. Everything's ambitious with you. You're also looking potentially at an IPO, a float of both your green steel, so your building materials business in Australia, and indeed businesses in the US. Will that presumably be market dependent? What will drive that?
I like to hope not, because I mean we're going to largely raise capital for the companies, and we're not selling down much, and we're not actually looking to raise that much. We won't float more than maybe 30–40%. So I think, irrespective of the market conditions, we'd probably want to get it away. Yeah. That would be the intention. And both
so by mid next year? Or?
Yeah, so I think Australian one will probably be first, followed soon after that with the US one. But there's a lot of work already happening on both.
Yeah, and obviously the timing of the cycle, because this is all driven by the infrastructure boom in Australia. You'd think.
Absolutely, the Australian business is all about the infrastructure. So we are the only producer of materials for that sector. It's entirely dependent on our different distribution businesses and our steelworks.
And you're obviously very confident in the cycle and how it's going to extend.
It's already proving itself. The business is doing extremely well, and it's going to get better and better. We have margin expansion. We have we have a lot of good aspects to these businesses which are pretty promising.
Yeah. Now, also, there's some rumour that maybe Morgan Stanley might be leading that. I noticed in the Financial Review today. Any truth in that?
I couldn't comment on that.
You couldn't comment because, of course, they know the assets, the RM assets, very well, don't they? Having sold it to you.
They did sell them to us. Yes. Yeah.
All right. Okay. So, looking at both America and Australia, you've also made, or in the progress of making, some very big acquisitions of ArcelorMittal in Europe. How's that going?
It's going. It's still a long way to go, but there's a process, there is approvals, there is various European Commission approvals and so on required. So it's still not certainly to be taken for granted, but it's progressing well.
Yeah. So you're confident that will come to fruition. Yes. And in the context of Brexit, once again, that is, as we said before, slightly hedging your risk there with these assets being in Eastern Europe. Yes.
I mean, the first one, which will actually cross the line, actually, hopefully tomorrow, is Dunkirk. So that's great. So that's our first.
Tomorrow. Yes. Now, well, Dunkirk. Well, that's something a little bit different. You've bought that off Rio.
Yes. That's not tomorrow, the Friday. But
Friday.
Yes, next few days.
So that's the aluminium, the big aluminium business. That's $500 million acquisition. Yes. Now, so I mean, the investment that you're putting into these businesses is extraordinary.
But these are great businesses. Dunkirk in particular, everything, the structure of that business is we've hedged out everything in terms of the inputs, the outputs, the aluminium, the alumina, the electricity, the operating parameters. Everything is set. So we're locking in our margin for the next few years.
So you contrast, say, Dunkirk and the ArcelorMittal assets as against, say, the Whyalla asset or some of the British assets which you bought when they were really in struggling conditions and you're turning them around. These assets are very different.
Yeah, very different. More mature. It's very mature businesses. This is about, so Dunkirk, for example, is not about how much more can we do with Dunkirk. There is not a lot more. There is some, but there's not a lot more we can do with it. That is more about the downstream strategy. So we will use that aluminium as a feed to our downstream auto strategy. We'll put the world's largest auto sheets and then auto body plant in Dunkirk itself. So it's a feed for that.
Tell us about your broad global strategy now, because your acquisitions are coming thick and fast in very different parts of the chain, I suppose. How will it all work?
We have our industrials business overall, which has steel, it has aluminium. Within steel, we have the green steel or the recycling building materials business, and then we have the primary business like Whyalla, which is large-scale blast furnace, iron ore-based operations. Aluminium is basically a downstream strategy. So basically, we look at aluminium as a source of liquid, a commodity which is, we believe, going to be more and more wanted because we need lighter cars, lighter everything, more efficient everything. Yeah. So that's more a feed towards the downstream strategy, and also it's a play on energy, because obviously aluminium is a very highly energy-intensive business. Yes. So we'll link that to our energy business. And then downstream engineering, auto in particular, and aerospace. So that's our industrials business. Yeah. Then our resources business is mining, which is, iron ore, coking coal. It's power. Power is a key part of our overall strategy. That's definitely, out of all of them, probably the most ambitious in terms of what we want to do here and in the UK and other parts of the world.
Right.
And then we have financial services, which is banks. We have one bank which is growing rapidly, another one on its way, and then we have our construction real estate.
So, Sanjeev, one comes back to the fact that you have been sliding the rule over these assets. You've obviously got to get your head, or your people do get their heads around these assets. You've got to get funding for all these assets. Now, one or two papers, particularly in Britain, have been on your tail a bit about whether you've got, quote, too many plates spinning. Have you got too many plates spinning, particularly in terms of funding?
Well, look, 2 points, right? We're a fast-growing group, always have been. 26 years, every single year we've grown rapidly. So when a group like us grows rapidly, there's people ask questions. We succeed where others haven't, so that also raises questions and so on. But Dunkirk is a very good example. It's got 7 world-class banks leading the transaction. The US transaction is a great example. We have BlackRock, the biggest fund in the world, backing it. So in terms of backers, we've got some great international backers in all our businesses.
Well, if I can just quote the FT, the perception that GFG might be struggling for funds was fuelled in recent weeks after Mr Gupta turned to rival traders to ask for some $160 million in loans linked to his acquisition of the Dunkirk smelter.
Yeah, I mean, it's not true. The numbers are complete nonsense. Yeah. But the other point is there is a trader involved in the transaction, but that is what you need. An industry needs a strong trading partner. That is how we used to be. We are basically from our DNA traders. Yes. There's nothing. That is absolutely the right partnership. Trading companies should partner with industries because industry should focus on the industrial business, and trading companies should focus on assisting with flows of material to different markets and different inputs.
So coming back to the floats next year, both in Australia and the US, I mean, that will require, in any case, you to be much more transparent because it'll be part of a listed company.
So that's part of the, actually that was the driving motivation to begin with.
Yeah.
To begin with, the motivation when we started looking at doing public markets, the main point was that there was a need, because of the way the group is organized, it's not really a group, it's a group with a small g, as I call it. Each investment is a separate bespoke investment. So it's like sort of more like a private equity model, where every business, like the Australian business, we bought it for 700 million, it was invested specifically. There's no ownership beyond this, it's separate bespoke group.
Yes.
So
your links are trading links, or sorry, or supply links.
Not even. There isn't. Sometimes there are, but in this case, for example, with Australia, our links with the rest of the world are very little. We do sell a little bit of slab to the UK, but it's a very small percentage of the overall business, right? Mostly it's a bespoke, separate business. So we provide information, financial information about each group, but what we want to do is now provide it in a more comprehensive way, so that then some of these naysayers or doubters can be silenced or at least answered. And one of the things in that is, if we have some public-facing companies like a public listed company here, one in the US, that will help, I think, because we have the portfolio. We'll say, okay, these are the businesses, and in that we have all the governance, all the disciplines, all the let's say the operating practices which are required to operate under in public markets, especially in Australia. I mean, there is a lot of governance here.
Interesting. I thought that also Matt Canavan and Simon Birmingham announced almost a lithium valley in terms of value add. Do you see this really sparking some genuine value add manufacturing industry?
I do, absolutely. First of all, there's different types of sparks, right? You saw there were various other investments announced Whyalla, which is really exciting, because it's not. I'm very keen to see not just us investing in Whyalla, but everybody else coming and sort of joining us, if you like, or taking advantage of what's happening there. So similarly, on a broader scale, on a larger scale, if we can show that Australia can have large-scale heavy industry, I'm sure others will do the same, and that might start a new journey for the country. I mean, I've always believed I have always had this dream that Australia can be a mega power in industrial space, because we've got every raw material you can think of.
Yes.
I often compare it to the US. They say, what does America got which Australia doesn't have?
Yeah.
We've got
but
everything.
Would you go into the battery side, do you think?
We're very keen on batteries, obviously, because it's a key ingredient in our energy mix.
Yes.
So to begin with, we're trying to work out how to do larger scale batteries and those sort of things, in terms of how to look at the battery technology itself. In terms of using lithium into batteries, that is a big undertaking. I'm very excited that that's being considered, because I think that's the next train, right? Yeah. We missed a couple of trains in the past. Australia missed a couple of trains in the past. This is the next one. So it'll be good if there is an initiative to encourage that we add value here rather than just exporting lithium.
Finally, Sanjeev Gupta is supposedly staying in Australia as his base with his family for, what, just under a year. Any chance you'll extend that?
Family's definitely going back.
Family's definitely going back. All right, but you might extend. You never know.
Time will tell. Yes.
All right, Sanjeev Gupta, once again, great to have the opportunity to talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
After the break, Telstra CEO Andy Penn on the 5G spectrum auction and the latest ACCC inquiry. Next.
Now, back to Ticky.
Welcome back. Well, the ACCC is set to probe Telstra's fixed line services to determine the access conditions placed on other telcos that use Telstra's copper network facilities for voice and broadband. Last month, the regulator said it will continue to regulate Telstra's copper network until at least 2024. The announcement came as Telstra CEO Andy Penn was giving an address at the Illawarra Business Chamber, where he gave more detail over the Telstra T22 strategy, with particular focus on small business. Well, for more, Your Money business editor James Daggar-Nickson spoke to Mr. Penn following his address.
Thanks, James. Actually, I haven't caught up with that ACCC announcement. I mean, other operators already have access to our copper network, and we provide that to them under a facilities access agreement on which the ACCC controls the pricing. And I know they have recently announced that they're going to extend the current arrangements out to 2024. But we're very comfortable with that and the arrangements that have existed in the past. But I must admit, I haven't seen the news today in relation to anything new.
It's been about 6 months since you announced the T22 strategy. Look, it had some mixed responses when it was announced, but 6 months on, where are you at? What's been done in that period?
Oh, look, I mean, I think we've come an enormous way. And I'd put the T22 strategy in the context of the $3 billion of investment we announced 2 years ago, because without that investment, we wouldn't be able to be doing what we're doing now. And over the last 2 years, we've reduced the number of calls into our call centre by 10 million. That's about 25%. We've reduced the number of complaints going to the industry's ombudsman by 30%. We've increased episode NPS by 13 points. Our network is digitised and 5G ready, and we're building out a whole new suite of business systems, CRM systems and order management systems, on which we're going to be able to launch what we believe are going to be the cutting-edge products and services for the future.
You've been quite vocal in regards NBN wholesale prices. Again, something you touched on today. How onerous are they at the moment from a reseller's perspective?
Well, look, I think the simple point is, it goes back to where you started the conversation on access to Telstra's original wholesale network. Basically, the wholesale price is more than doubled under the NBN, and it's set to go even higher. And we reference some research internationally from Ovum today, which sort of looked at the top sort of 30 internet markets or broadband markets in the world, and Australia's the 5th most expensive amongst them. And prices can only go higher because currently the industry basically makes no money out of reselling the NBN at that level of wholesale price, and so something has to give.
And what is that? I mean, Bill Morrow, the former NBN CEO, was optimistic right and up until his exit just a couple of weeks ago. You had Stephen Rue insisting that the market could continue to shoulder the sky-high access charges. So what gives?
Well, I think their view would be you've got to push up prices to consumers. My view would be consumers don't want to pay more, and wholesale prices are already high internationally. So what has to give is the wholesale price.
By how much?
Oh, as I've said before, by $20, not $2.
And is that then likely to see a degree of a write-down as far as the value to the government of the NBN?
Oh, look, I don't profess to know, and it's not for me to sort of comment really on the accounting of the NBN. I mean, the simple point is what we need a vibrant and successful fixed broadband market and also a mobile market. And you've also heard me say before, I mean, the sort of the thought that 5G is going to replace the NBN is wrong. It will certainly have an impact, but what we want as customers is we need both of those technologies to work in tandem. They complement each other. So ultimately, from a customer point of view, you know, customers don't care whether they're connected via mobile or via fixed. They just want the connectivity, and our job is to bring that to them, and we've got to be able to do that at a price point which is affordable.
So you don't subscribe to this view that if you don't see a cut in prices by NBN, that you could potentially look to go around the NBN, provide some sort of an alternative, fixed wireless, something backed by 5G technology.
Well, there's no doubt that 5G technology has got more capacity and faster speeds than 4G, but you have to put it in context. The average customer that's using the NBN today is probably downloading somewhere in the order of 250 gigabits of data per month. The average customer on the mobile network is probably downloading 5. So that's 50 times as much. Radio access technology, such as 4G, 5G, is very, very efficient and it's very, very fast. But when you're talking about heavy lifting, large volumes of data, that's when you need fibre, copper or cable. And so that's why I say those two technologies have to work and complement each other. There's no doubt as 5G rolls out, I'm sure more customers will choose to go mobile only. And as I've said publicly previously, that could be another 10 to 15% of customers. But 5G is not going to replace the NBN, it's going to complement the NBN.
Just on 5G, Andy Penn, there was an important auction for spectrum earlier this week. Telstra secured a lot of spectrum at the auction. There is a lot riding on 5G for the industry, but for Telstra in particular, it's something that you've repeatedly spoken about. Is it going to be enough to fill that earnings gap that everyone is very, very quick to point to?
Look, I think the point about 5G is what's exciting about it is firstly, it's a step change in terms of the performance over 4G. But the really interesting thing for 5G is it's arriving at the same time as other technologies are maturing. So things like cloud computing, artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things. And when you bring that together with 5G, it's going to open up for businesses and for communities incredible opportunities for technology innovation and to leverage technology. And what sits at the heart of that is the telecommunications network. And we've always had the best, and we've always been a leader in telecommunications technology, and that's why we're determined to be so with 5G as well.
3G and 4G proved to be, in your words, absolute step changes. Are you confident that 5G is going to be able to deliver the same sort of growth rates? Because there are questions as to whether or not it's going to be able to.
Well, one of the things I reflect on as I look back on 3G and 4G is ultimately the use cases and the benefits that 3G and 4G ultimately delivered were not predicted at the time those technologies were launched. If you just think about 4G and the whole way in which it's enabled the app environment and streaming, that wasn't contemplated back in 2012, 2013 when 4G was first being canvassed. So I think that's going to be the case with 5G. We're going to have use cases and opportunities which we can't even imagine today.
Well, that's all for the show tonight. Tomorrow night, Jeff Wilson, the chairman of Wilson Asset Management, with just a small view on franking credits. Join me tomorrow at 4:30 p.m. or tonight on Catch Up at 10 p.m. Thanks for your company.